All right, well, I'm Heather Miano Kopelson. It is such an honor to be here today. I'm not Indigenous, so I strive to act as an ally. I do have family history that made me aware of structural racism and the power of the settler colonial state from an early age. History that isn't embodied in my grandmother's trunk, painted with her family's Japanese internment camp number. And of course, being Japanese American is not the same as being Indigenous, but I mention it because looking back, asking questions about that trunk was the beginning of my wanting to become a historian and my skepticism about the benevolence of the nation state. I work and live on chattel land at the flagship university of a state that encompasses the ancestral homelands of many Indigenous nations, including Porch Band of Creek Indians, Cherokee Tribe of Northeast Alabama, and Moa Band of Choctaws, as well as many that the US government forcibly relocated: Seminole, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Quapaw-Osage, and Illinois Confederation. Moundville, a Mississippian state site that is significant to all southeastern peoples, is only 20 miles away. And I should note that the University of Alabama has no official land acknowledgement, so I use one developed in collaboration with the very newly founded Indigenous student group at UA. As all of the presenters have rightly thanked Scott Stevens and Ruben and all of ACMRS and Em, Leah, and all the staff for all the work that it takes to put on an event like that. Thank you all so much. And to all of you, presenters and audience, for what has been such a generative 2 days. And I hope that I can continue it with this presentation. There have been so many connections with what I'm about to share with you from all of these presentations that I could use that to fill all my time, but I won't. I won't be like an undergrad and just say what they said. So I hope that teasing some of those connections out can be part of the discussion afterwards. I'd like to explore a category of indigeneity that stretches across time, connects generations and places, and yet is also incredibly specific, not only to individual humans, but even down to individual beads. The making of objects was and is and will be a means of tending relations among human and non-human persons, of connecting to a place, and of connecting across generations. I want us to think about indigeneity through the material world, through the practices that people engaged in during pre- and early modern eras, as well as how those practices continue today. Just to give a quick example to start with, this is a twine skirt that was made by Mary Smith, a fiber artist, a Muskogee fiber artist. Spinning fibers into yarn and twining or weaving that yarn into accessories or clothing, creating adornments out of feathers, shell, stone, or metal to incorporate into the items, or shaping pots and other vessels from clay, to name only a few examples. All of it shows continuity as well as innovation, for which settler colonial boundaries are barely relevant. After a broader discussion of how making objects tends relations, I'll offer 2 pairs of specific examples, and then close with an invitation to think about how to bring the process of making things into the classroom. Theorist Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard have already been invoked in this room for their emphasis on the place-based core values and norms of a given Indigenous society. In Simpson's articulation, Anishinaabeg philosophy is rooted in the land and the relations among all the persons, human and non-human, in that space, connections that must be mutual and should be formed with consent. Along with that principle comes 3 others: non-interference, a respect for self-determination, and diversity. Although each Native community, whether recognized by a colonial power or not, has its own ceremonies to live out and acknowledge its core values, many hold to similar ideals. Anyone who has handcrafted an item, especially something that took as much processing and preparation as textiles, whether or not they had any other materials attached to them, understands that the creator of an object spends an extended amount of time bringing it into being, which establishes an intimate relationship between creator and object. An expert on the creation of fabric estimated that twining a moderately dense skirt or mantle without decorations would take about 180 hours. And that does not even include dyeing the yarn or making the yarn. That's just to twine the skirt. Even before getting to the stages of making the yarn, weaving or twining or knotting it into fabric, there's the matter of procuring and processing the fiber in preparation for spinning the yarn. Plants have to be gathered or planted, cultivated and harvested. The fibers have to then be processed from the raw plant material. For plants where the fibers come from tough stalks, the stalks have to be separated from the usable fibers in some way. Depending on the plant, that could entail soaking the stalks in water until they rotted, making it easier to pound away that outer layer. Animal fibers, such as rabbit fur or silk, require similar, though of course not identical, steps to process the raw material. The animal has to be raised or hunted, then their fur or fleece or cocoon or feathers cleaned and processed. Or there's also making the tools required to spin. Some people just use twisting on their leg, others use a drop spindle. And as tools go, spindles are fairly simple. A central shaft is attached to a disc or whorl to give the device enough weight to keep spinning. There's a notch, or in more recent times, a metal hook at the end to catch the yarn and stop it from over-twisting. Once the spinning is done, the yarn has to be wound off the spindle so it can be used to weave or twine. Any decorative element to the fabric increases the time by massive amounts. That time might include gathering shells and making beads, or trading for beads, or the required tools. Drilling holes in shells or seeds might be required, flattening feathers and preparing the quills, attaching metal tinkler cones, which required either trading for already made tinklers or cutting them from a larger piece of metal and then rolling them into a tinkler. The multimedia artist Vanessa Dion Fletcher, who's Potawatomi and Lenape, sees her practice of working with porcupine quills as significant because of the way the quills bind her to the land from which they came. The material is significant to her not because her ancestors used it before an arbitrary point in the past and therefore is traditional, but because it connects her to the land and to its creatures. Each step of collecting, preparing, dyeing, and sewing with the quills offers an opportunity to exist in relation to other living beings and the places in which they live. In many indigenous cultures of the Americas, that distinction between animate and inanimate objects is not always clear-cut, because objects could become, or always were, more than inert things manipulated by humans. They could become or house other than human beings through inherent characteristics of the object or through a specific ritual or protocol. For instance, the first time the Nisga'a Tsimshian and Gitxsan dance group Gitxaayasq, people of the Copper Shield, dances with a newly crafted mask, they are dancing the mask alive so that it becomes a ceremonial being. As a ceremonial being, it is an important member of the community and takes on an existence distinct from its creator and with its own personhood and ability to act in the world. In other situations and with other participants, an object can become a vessel that houses an other than human being. Either way, objects are connected to a web of complex relations, and making them is part of tending those relations. Living energy resided in much more than humans, non-human animals, and plants. It wasn't only a matter of grammar. Many languages have a way to distinguish between animate and inanimate nouns, but of fundamental outlooks on life. In the Andes, the concept was called kame. If a thing had matter, it had kame. Scholars have interpreted this concept in differing ways, some describing it as a power, while others saw it as a life force. Mayan cosmologies also contained a certain blurring of Western perceived separations between living thing and non-living thing. Moving north, when the Micmac began acquiring copper kettles from the French at the beginning of the 17th century, they extended their sense of kin relationships to the kettles. Kettles were not merely trade objects acquired, they became other than human Micmac beings. Potential examples of exactly how this can work to look at an object and think about indigeneity and tending relations are nearly infinite, but since we do not have infinite time, I will only discuss two pairs before opening up the conversation to all of you. The first pair is two stunning feather cloaks, one from the 16th century and one from the 21st. And the second pair is a spondylus shell breastplate from between 900 and 1100 of the Common Era that was found on a Toltec altar, and then a wampum belt made 3 years ago to commemorate Wampanoag survivance in the face of settler colonial celebrations of the 1620 voyage of the Mayflower. So this photograph shows a 7-foot-long red feathered cape against a dark background. It's draped over a stand to mimic how it would hang from a wearer's shoulders. Hanging immobile in the case, the cape is only perceptible through some of the senses. For those who can see the color red, or at least discern the outlines of the thousands of feathers, it is striking visually. But encased in glass, it is untouchable. No odor of old feathers crosses that barrier, and the only measurable sound comes from the ventilation system of the European museum in which it hangs. Even if it were possible to interact with the cape with all the senses, including proprioception, most observers today would not be able to access the full range of meaning that it imparts because they would not be interacting with it as part of a living culture and community. As we've heard discussed in the symposium, the full significance of some objects is only appropriate for individuals specifically trained for and tasked with interacting with them. Filling in at least some context, however, is accessible to anyone willing to take the time and energy required to consider all the work it took to create. And so this particular cape comes from the beginning of the 16th century when the Tupinamba began to establish trading alliances with some of the European travelers from the East in what we now know as Brazil. A key part of the ritual life centered on humans transforming into birds and taking on their capabilities. Magnificent feathered capes, headgear, belts, anklets, and bracelets were the key to this metamorphosis. The production of feathered capes and other body adornments made with feathers required expertise in the different tasks required to make them and involved the participation of many people. Hunters had to trap or shoot the birds and pluck their feathers. Then the feathers had to be collected and stored, as it took dozens of birds to produce enough feathers to make a neck-to-ankle cape. Depending on the kind of feather and the desired effect, the feathers might be painted or injected with dye while still on a living bird. The framework of the cape consisted of cotton thread woven and knotted into a fine yet strong web to support the attachment of the thousands of feathers. And of course, producing the thread involved first cultivating the cotton and harvesting it, then processing it by removing seeds, the protective outer layer, and other heavy and sharp plant matter. Next, the clean fibers needed to be combed or otherwise manipulated to lie as much in one direction as possible so that a spinster, to use the European term for the skilled laborer engaged in such an activity, could separate the fibers just enough to create a thread of the desired thickness before twisting them together. Although the basic operation of twisting fibers together is simple, creating a thread of consistent thickness with no weak spots where it might break requires expertise. And what you see here are the ways that an artisan would have to weave and knot the web as well as attach each feather individually. And that required further levels of expertise in manipulating fine threads. So the top shows, it might be a little hard to see because it's kind of yellow on yellow, but it shows what it looks like with actual feathers, and then you've got the drawing underneath. So you can see that there's the quill of each feather is attached to the yarn, so all this would take quite a long time. Making the capes was a community enterprise that involved both men and women. Men typically hunted the birds and collected the feathers, while women produced the cotton thread and webs, as well as attached the feathers. Tupinamba artisans used the feathers of a range of birds to make garments and accessories, trading for the most desired types with people further inland in what is now Brazil. Their sources included parrots, toucans, scarlet ibis, and once they had been introduced by European colonizers, chickens. They tended to dye the chicken's feathers brighter colors. The susurrations of the feathers as Tupinamba individuals moved their bodies in familiar ways did more than continue to enact their particular way of interfacing with the world around them. It connected them across time in the dances passed from elders to the next generation, and in the myriad of skills required to make the feathered garments and accessories taught by women to their younger female relatives. The violence of genocide and settler colonialism have attenuated those relationships, in some cases, severing them completely. But indigenous communities are revitalizing and reclaiming knowledge, at times reverse engineering the skills where there is no one living to teach them. A present-day example from a different part of the world is the work of textile specialist Julia, shows a bonnet with a cape. So another kind of feathered object. The work of textile specialist Julia Martin, who's a Quina Wampanoag, and she spent a year incorporating individual turkey feathers into the corded twists of a 4x6 twined mantle. Although Martin used cotton cord instead of dogbane, milkweed, or false nettle, she manipulated the cord in the same way as did her ancestors. She unveiled the mantle to Quina Wampanoag elders at the Quina Powwow in September of 2023. She also shared it with other Wampanoag elders. Joan Tavares Avant, who's Mashpee Wampanoag, recounted the pride and cultural understanding she felt when Martin placed the cloak over her. So many feathers I could not count. Her intense bodily response to the cloak, shaking and crying, bore out the power and emotion embodied in the object, both for the creator and for those who interacted with it in briefer ways. The constellations of connections contained within the cape added to its cultural heft. Martin's is the first Wampanoag turkey feather cape in 400 years to be made using these ancient techniques. But she crafted it looking to the future, wanting to pass on her reclaimed skill and the ways it connected her to her ancestors. The mantle was also part of tending relations in Martin's present with elders and with other than human persons. All right, the second pair I'll touch on today are two accessories of worked shell, an apron and necklace found in a Toltec palace altar, and a wampum belt created as a community response to celebrations of Mayflower 400. I'm not trying to flatten differences across time, space, and culture. Instead, I want to focus our attention on that relationship between maker and object, and how the making of the object in itself is an expression of indigeneity when it is about being in relation to others. It can very much be an act of resistance. It is tending those definitional relations to human and non-human community, including those that make place. And while you're looking at this image, I should note that these shells are reproductions of the originals that archaeologists made to try and figure out how it was put together. Specific other than human beings associated with marine shell differ from culture to culture, but across the globe, people associated the material with life-giving force, fertility, and rain. Sometimes used whole, artisans have also shaped these exoskeletons into beads and other adornments. And the journey from shell as house to adornment contains several steps. The artisan needed to obtain a blank, which could happen through trade, short or long distance, or gathering in the local environment. Depending on the shape of the shell and the desired portion for the blank, the artisan used a pounding or a cutting tool, often made of a hard stone substance, to flake or break off a blank. Next came shaping the blank into a bead or pendant, a stage which allows for the wide variance in skill level and finesse among artisans. Shaping could happen through careful controlled breaks or by grinding against a rough surface. The shaped blank must then be perforated with percussion or grinding and then decorated, whether with incisions or dyes. The last step was polishing. Visually complex zoomorphic pendants are not the only evidence of the maker's power, creativity, and skill. Smaller planar objects, like beads, that are missing any marks left from making mistakes that then had to be corrected, also display great skill. So this apron and necklace, the Coraza de Tula, was found in the Toltec Palace altar. As I said, artisans created it somewhere between 900 and 1100, and it is a masterpiece of techniques used over 2,500 years. The 1,204 pieces of shell worked into 6 distinct shapes would have weighed down the Coraza's wearer, even as the slightest movement resulted in a cascade of sound as shell struck shell. The rectangular body of the apron was made up of pieces of the red thorny oyster, Spondylus princeps, a shell still accorded ritual importance in many societies, while the necklace consisted of square, circular, and flower-shaped discs strung together. Whole olivella shells hung from the bottom edge of the apron. Now, this particular garment and necklace may have been worn once or not at all, given its location as an offering at an altar, and that's also probably why it was found whole. Of course, with the organic cording disintegrated, but in place. This was a man's garment, and more than that, it was a leader's garment, meant to imbue the wearer with symbolic strength of those who went before him. But that strength did not come only from men. Women contributed essential skill and labor to the apron in the spinning and weaving of the plant fiber base, if not in the shaping of the shell pieces. Iconographic representations of gender are not clear on the gender of shell artisans in Toltec society. Shell working techniques can also tell us about changes in political relationships, sometimes across a very short period of time, which I'm teasing you with here, so if you're interested, you can ask in the Q&A. The 21st century example, there's the spondylus shell. The 21st century example is a wampum belt made with a type of shell bead that is broadly, although partially known, to have become enough to have become a standard part of US history textbook narratives. Historically, artisans made the purple and white beads from quahog clam and lightning whelk shells that became an essential repository and expression of Haudenosaunee diplomacy, history, and spiritual power. Although the indigenous peoples of southern New England did not use the beads as extensively to record diplomatic relationships and agreements, as did their Haudenosaunee and Abenaki neighbors, they still regarded wampum as a powerful substance with great symbolic and spiritual weight. In the late 17th century, the Pakasset Sunkswa Weetamoo made and adorned herself in girdles of wampum which she wore from the loins upward, to use the words from Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, which, any literature people in the audience might have heard of. As Weetamoo participated in ritual dances, the strings and belts of beads clinked against each other and other embellishments, producing sonic vibrations that merged with the participants' and observers' bodies. The swinging beads amplified the visual effect of her movement for those around her, while they added heft and weight to her kinetic experience. The physical adornments were an expression of her spiritual and political ability to weave alliances. So again, we have that tending relations aspect. Crafting beads remains an important statement of community today. The creation of one belt in particular was a way to talk back to a dominant narrative of history that privileged European perspectives and assumptions. Linda Coombs and Paula Peters, Mashpee Wampanoag, and others wove a 5-foot belt to tell a Wampanoag version of the events and relations commemorated in the exhibit Mayflower 400 that glorified English colonization in Wampanoag country. Now, I want to use the last couple of minutes to follow Taryn in explaining how I bring this work into the classroom, especially when I'm not necessarily teaching a class that's specifically Native history. And I teach students how to spin I bring in very basic spindles, and I bring in some unspun wool, and I have them try to make fiber. And sometimes some of them catch on really quickly, others do not, and they get very frustrated. I have them do it in pairs so they don't have to worry about too many motions at once, but it always, at the end, they always say, that's why cloth is so valuable. Because even though we had talked about it in class before, right, that it was one of the most valuable things a household could have, if you're talking about like colonial European households, I could tell that they didn't quite get it. But once they try to make just, like 5 inches of yarn, and it keeps falling apart on them, then they realize that, oh yes, this is a skill, and it takes a lot of time to make things. I also have had Porch Creek basket makers come to teach how to make baskets, and when they do that, they talk about the meaning that basket weaving has for them, the relations it connects them to, how a Muskogee basket weaver came from Oklahoma to teach them how to weave the baskets, and while she was in Alabama, gathered the right type of river cane that doesn't grow in Oklahoma to make the baskets. And again, it's the kind of thing where until they try making it, we use binder cane, just commercial cane, they realize how difficult it would be to say, weave a basket that won't let any seeds fall through. And I had originally, thought, oh, maybe I could bring in wool and spindles, and then I realized there was no time. So instead of that, what I would ask you to do is to turn to a neighbor and just briefly brainstorm about what you could have students make that is relevant, to your courses, and how that might connect to ideas and practices of indigeneity. All right, so if you could break off your lovely conversations and think about if you're willing to share with everyone. All right, so I know not all of you may do things that are directly related to textiles, but I'm just curious to know what you came up with. Yeah. Oh, there we go.
I actually teach like a long media history class, so there's stuff they have to make. But I was thinking of Jessica Palinko's talk yesterday, and whoever is doing the video, I would love an early cut of the video to show my students, but to make them see if they can actually do a brush, right? Not with one rabbit hair, right? I also have vegetarians in there, so I will say you can come up with another kind of hair for the brush, your choice, right? Oh, that will be an interesting conversation.
Human hair, I believe, is what you were suggesting, right?
To like have them try to make a brush to see what they can do from there.
Yeah.
So I have had students not make, obviously, wampum, but pass out wampum beads and then pass out quahog shells. And say, you tell me how to get from that object to that little bead, and then make 10,000 of them for me, because that's what I need. Because I think it's better now in textbooks, but when I was a kid, it would say things like, wampum was the Indian word for money. And it's like, one word among 500 languages? Curious.
Yeah.
And it's not, of course, the word for money, right? But they do have tremendous value because we recognize the labor, the human labor that goes into making one, and we need thousands to make these things. And so when they hold them, like they get it, like, and I say, and you have to make that with a stone, just on your way to the shop. And they get it. You know, it's something very palpable to hold that in your hand. And so it's something we do, but a similar idea.
Yeah.
So I'm teaching an Andean archaeology class this semester, and for one of the activities that I have planned actually is for the students to make their own quipus, which is the knotted string records that the Inca used for bureaucratic purposes. But I'll challenge them to figure out some way to encode their name into the quipu. So yeah, that's something I already planned, so that was a great question.
Ooh, I think I may have to borrow that one. Anyone's or questions about? Yeah.
So I was just saying, I work on questions of sexuality in the Atlantic world and the early modern period, and so the thing that I thought about was a hammock, and just like to bring in hammocks into class and just think about like scale and space and privacy, because just like in this period, like privacy is a social contract between people, you know, in these very tiny spaces. And so I thought that might be interesting. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think especially depending on where you're teaching and where students come from, you know, if they are from a place where in a background where they have had their own room, you know, and have never had to share a space, maybe they haven't even had to share a bathroom, like that's a very different sense of privacy, yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question about the amazing red cape shawl deal. Could you just maybe come back a little bit to who's wearing that for what occasions? Because that can't be everyday wear.
No,
but
not.
I'm also not really clear like what ceremonial purpose it serves as an object.
Well, so the ceremony, it would have been worn by ritual specialists, and the ceremonial purpose was to help the specialist transform into a bird. And so that's also why you have the bonnet. And then in terms of the question of exactly who might be those religious specialists, the art historian Amy Buono has done a lot of work. There's a missionary account that says the one time he saw women wearing this, And so then scholars have discussed, well, could women wear these cloaks, as well as participate in making them? Present-day practice is that men are the ones who wear the cloaks. But again, based on the missionary account, and then also knowing the role that women played in society as elders and as just knowledge keepers, she argues that women would have been among the ritual specialists. So yes, this was not an everyday garment.
But did you say whether women or men made the feather ritual cape?
Yeah, so it was a community effort. For the Tupinamba, it seems like the men were the ones who hunted the birds or gathered the feathers. Women were the ones who wove the netting and then also attached the feathers. In other communities, like in this area of the world, once macaws are brought up from Mesoamerica, women are often responsible for raising birds. So rather than, they're not being hunted, they're being kept in pens. Some are turkeys, but some, again, are the macaws. But in every case, it's an effort involving everybody. Also, of course, other genders as well. So all of this comes out of my present work on looking at Indigenous women's labor and material culture and thinking about the ways that, when we have all of those European drawings of what they think Native people look like, how we can see women present even though the Europeans didn't, right? We can see the fruits of their labor even when Europeans did not represent the objects they made accurately.
Heather, this was a great talk. I have a question about just method a little bit. Mm-hmm. I love how you put things beside each other. There was something really interesting about having something from an early modern artifact with a creation in the present. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I guess it feels like it's a commentary on a lot of different things, not just the fact that this is sort of giving it new life, but also it's a kind of anti-teleology, anti-timeline, anti-what's mm-hmm. before, what's after. I don't know, I guess I wanted to hear more about how you process, how you even, talking to students, how do we look at these things together, right, beside each other? And just that besidedness feels really powerful as a method.
Right, yeah, and part of the reason I do that is because drawing on Eve Tuck and others who've talked about past to present to future, but of course not all peoples have this linear concept of time. And so to acknowledge that and thinking about the way actions can stretch across time and the way people do that to connect in that way. And so I think, it's something that especially if I have, if I try to get students to think about it from their own experience of just, did they ever have an older person in their life teach them how to make anything, for example, right? And thinking about how, it was that relationship, right, that they really remember. And of course, not the same thing, but just to get them to think about that connection. And so it's also because what I really want to do with this project is to have the undergrad readers understand there are Indigenous people today, which is, as you all know, sadly something that still has to be told to students. And so putting them next to each other, I think also allows us to think about all of that work, right, of sometimes it is continuity, but then for some people it has been reclamation or, as I said, reverse engineering. And so thinking about, well, if we want to think about differences and change over time and all of that, then we can look at, well, how has that skill been passed on or not?
It's really interesting that you said that the Cape, the function of the Cape was part of a sort of ceremony that enabled transformation into the animal, into the bird. And this made me think about Ashley's presentation and work yesterday, just thinking about like the idea of indigenous philosophies, right? Philosophies derived from indigenous practices. And so I just wondered about like, do you think that there's a way in which the construction process and the sort of material makeup of the Cape allows you to think about the philosophy underlying transformational process, like how transformation from one state of being into another works that might be very different from the sort of Ovidian or whatever kinds of tropes we tend to bring to that in Western traditions.
Yeah. I think so, and again, it comes down to the tactile, or at least for me it does, right? To take, that experience of taking something from disparate pieces, and then, depending on what you're doing, bringing them together to create this new object. I think that kind of simple transformation can offer, at least a basic metaphor for understanding more, what's the word I'm looking for? Esoteric transformations. And the other thing, of course, some students are really stuck on, but did they really? Like, that's not the point, right?
Heather, thank you so much. That's fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.